of a certain age, as I am, will remember in home economics class, I think they more recently have called it family and consumer science, they teach you to sew, and you always put your pattern grain arrows parallel to the lengthwise grain. Now, why don't we do that in patchwork? Well, I told myself, why don't we do that? And that's the way I cut my patches. I call them short strips. I use fat quarters and half yards, and I cut parallel to the lengthwise grain when I cut my strips. Now, there are several advantages to lengthwise strips. The main advantage, of course, is stability of the grain. Let me show you the difference here. This has a lengthwise stripe. The selvage has been cut off of this. See how firm this is? Now I take about the same length of it. See how it stretches? That's the crosswise grain. You've been cutting along the crosswise grain instead of the lengthwise grain if you've been doing rotary cutting, I warrant. And that's not the most stable grain. You can do better than that. And let me show you how short strips can help you have more stability in your patchwork. Here we have the selvage, and parallel to the selvage we have a nice straight cut that goes even with the print. But you'll notice this is a 90-degree angle, but the print veers off farther and farther from the edge along this side, and that's typical of the crosswise grain. You get the print aligns much better with the lengthwise grain than it does with the crosswise grain. For squares, half square triangles, and quarter square triangles, you're going to have a lengthwise and a crosswise grain on your patch, and it doesn't matter that much whether you cut lengthwise strips or crosswise strips. So you know, you can, if that's all you ever sew, you won't need to even think about lengthwise grain, although I do believe that starting with your best foot forward, you should start with the lengthwise grain for your strips. Okay, I'm going to press a small part of this. I'm only going to be cutting a single strip, so I don't need to press very much. Now notice I am putting the selvage right here, and I'm aligning the right ends because I'm right-handed. If you were left-handed, you would align the left ends of the strip of the yardage. I iron these together. That sticks them together for cutting. It really does help. And I make a note that this selvage is deeper than the one I have on top. I'm going to be cutting off about a ½ inch at the selvage in order to avoid that white area. Sometimes your fabrics are slightly different lengths, don't worry about it. And now I want to show you when your fabric is a totally different length. I've got a long yardage here. This is my lengthwise grain. And I'm stacking 4 different fabrics to cut 18-inch long strips from each of them. And even though this one is several yards long, I'm just going to cut 18 inches worth off of this. Now I'm going to transfer this to my cutting table. I smooth this out on my cutting table, and I'm going to be cutting off about a ½ inch here so that I don't have that white selvage in my patchwork. Oh, and I didn't cut all the way through. That gives me a nice crisp line. Everything's the same even if the selvage has been cut off, I'll take a cut there just so that the 4 fabrics have the same cut. Now I'm going to cut a 1.5 inch strip. You may wonder why I'm cutting from side to side instead of away from my body. I'm right-left challenged, and I can never remember which way to lay the fabric, and so I do it this way. You can do it the other way if you prefer cutting away from yourself. So that's how I've cut my strip. Now at the right end that I aligned, I'm squaring it up, and now I can cut squares or rectangles or whatever patch I want. So here I'll cut a 1.5 inch square. There you go. And that's all there is to it. Cutting lengthwise strips is really scarcely any different from cutting crosswise strips. It just gives you the stability, and it also gives you scrap variety. Because the strips are only 18 inches long, you don't have so many units that are the same. Try short strips on the lengthwise grain and see how your quilt making improves.